There's no way Stephanie White is going to sit there on the sidelines, watch Dejanay Carrington clearly target and clothesline Sophie Cunningham, and then get on the podium in front of reporters and defend Dejanay Carrington, right? There's no way, right? Right.
There's no way, except there was a way, except it happened, except Stephanie White walked to that podium with Sophie Cunningham bleeding in the locker room and defended the player who clotheslined her. And Sophie Cunningham, who has spent an entire season telling truths that no other active player in this league was willing to tell, who has stood up for Caitlin Clark when nobody else would, who went to war publicly for her teammates while her own coach stayed silent, has reportedly confirmed what many suspected was coming. This is her last season in Indiana.
Stephanie White goes on the podium and refuses to back up her player, Sophie Cunningham. Stephanie White, like we've said this time and time again, a snake in the grass. She needs to go. She needs to get fired. She refused to stand up for Caitlin Clark when Caitlin Clark got a fist in her throat.
A snake in the grass. That is the characterization, and it is backed by a documented, season-long pattern of a coaching staff that has consistently, publicly, and on live television chosen to protect every institutional relationship, except the ones that matter most to the two players most responsible for this franchise's relevance. Sophie Cunningham bled on that floor. Her own coach defended the player who made her bleed, and Sophie is done. The WNBA is in chaos tonight, not because of the flagrant foul as brutal as it was, not because of social media white privilege posts, not because of the ejection or the league review or the suspension, because the player who has been the most vocal, most principled, most unconditionally loyal defender of the Indiana Fever's franchise player all season, the player who barely survived financially while telling the truths that nobody else was willing to tell, watched her own head coach defend the player who left her bleeding and made a decision. But what really started all of this is not what fans think. To understand why Sophie Cunningham's confirmation that this is her last season in Indiana carries the weight that it does, why it is not just a free agent decision, but a documented, public, principled statement about the coaching environment she has been navigating, you have to start with what the camera captured and what came after it. Dejanay Carrington came down on Sophie Cunningham's head with two hands, not going for the ball, not a basketball play disguised as dangerous contact, on two hands, going for the head, in a play that was called a flagrant 2 foul and resulted in an immediate ejection. Sophie Cunningham got up with blood in her mouth.
This was the play.
Face coming down, trying to prevent the layup, but that is just
clearly not going for the ball. Two hands going for Sophie Cunningham's head. Sophie Cunningham gets up, not too excited about it. Gets up bleeding with blood in her mouth.
Blood in her mouth, 2 hands to the head, a flagrant 2. The most serious foul designation in the WNBA rulebook, reserved for contact that goes beyond the competitive bounds of professional basketball and into the territory of deliberately dangerous physical aggression. The referees saw it, the league saw it, the basketball world watching in real time saw it. Every observer who was present, from fans in the building to viewers at home to the entire social media universe that immediately began dissecting the replay, arrived at the same conclusion. This was not incidental. This was not a basketball play that went wrong. This was targeted, and Sophie Cunningham stood up with blood in her mouth and looked toward her bench. Her coach walked to the podium and defended the player who hit her.
I don't oppose the hard foul, but I also don't think that she intentionally went for the net. One of the things about Nay is that she's going to play her butt off, man. She's going to compete. Nobody's going to go walking in for a layup.
Nobody's going to go walking in for a layup. That is what's said at the podium in the immediate aftermath of a flagrant 2 foul that sent her own player to the locker room with blood in her mouth. Not a defense of Sophie Cunningham. Not an acknowledgement that the ejection was warranted. Not a single word about the player who absorbed the contact. Praise for the player who delivered it. The competitive spirit. The refusal to let opponents get easy baskets. The toughness that Carrington brings, while Sophie Cunningham's mouth was bleeding.
I do oppose the hard foul, and I do think she intentionally went for the neck. Something tells me Sophie Cunningham's not going to be as forgiving as Caitlin Clark is. Something tells me Sophie Cunningham can kind of see through the bullshit a little bit better than CC22.
See through the BS a little bit better. That assessment delivered in the immediate aftermath of White's podium defense is exactly correct, because Sophie Cunningham is not Caitlin Clark in one specific important way. Clark has maintained her public composure with remarkable discipline all season. She has absorbed the coaching decisions, the press conference language, the organizational communication failures, and the coaching staff's institutional alignment choices with the kind of controlled professional restraint that reflects both her character and the calculation she is running about when and how to respond publicly. Sophie Cunningham does not run that calculation the same way. Sophie Cunningham says what she sees. She always has. It is the quality that made her the most important public voice defending Clark all season when other active players stayed quiet. And it is the quality that is now driving the confirmation that this is her last season in Indiana, because Sophie Cunningham looked at what her head coach did at that podium and made the same assessment she has been making publicly about the institutional environment around Clark all season. This organization is not on your side. The Sophie Cunningham podium defense, or more accurately, the complete absence of one, did not arrive in a vacuum. It is the latest expression of a coaching pattern that has been documented all season. A pattern that predates this specific incident, that has a specific time-stamped history reaching back to before became the Indiana Fever's head coach. And it is a pattern that connects White's Connecticut Sun past directly to the institutional choices she's been making inside the Indiana Fever's locker room all year.
This is the coach that was DeJournette's coach when DeJournette poked Caitlin Clark in the eye rookie season. This was the coach that the first game of the year, DeJournette Carrington hip-checked Caitlin Clark in the middle of the game. This is the same coach that watched over Marina Mabry body tackle Caitlin Clark into the seats. This is the same coach that defended Alyssa Thomas's fist and throat. This coach is completely okay with it.
Completely okay with it. That is the institutional posture, not a single incident of poor judgment at a podium, but a documented, multi-incident, cross-season pattern of a coaching staff that has been either unwilling or unable to protect its players from dangerous contact. The eye poke on Clark in the rookie season, the hip check in the first game of the year, Marina Mabry body tackling Clark into the seats, Alyssa Thomas's fist in the throat, each one a moment where the coaching staff's institutional response was at best inadequate, and at worst in the specific cases where White defended the players who committed the contact and active endorsement of the targeting. Sophie Cunningham watched all of that happen to her teammate. She was the one who spoke out about it publicly when nobody else would. She was the one who named the institutional jealousy, the coordinated resistance, the old guard's organized response to Clark's arrival. She did it at personal and professional cost, in a league where speaking uncomfortable truths has institutional consequences, and now the targeting has been directed at her. And the coaching staff's response is the same one it has always given.
See, this coach doesn't have your back. And you got to start realizing that this coach doesn't have your back. Nobody on this team actually has your back except for Sophie Cunningham. Nobody on this team, coaches, players, has ever shown that they have your back, that they're ever willing to actually speak out for you other than Sophie Cunningham.
Nobody except Sophie Cunningham. That is the documented reality, and it is a reality that Sophie's confirmation of her departure makes even more significant. Because when Sophie Cunningham leaves Indiana at the end of this season, Caitlin Clark loses the one person in that organization who has consistently, publicly, unconditionally had her back. The one player who went on record, who named the coordinated campaign, who described the institutional jealousy, who stood at the intersection of her own barely surviving financial reality and her commitment to telling the truth about what was being done to her teammate and chose the truth every time. Clark loses that when Sophie leaves. And the Indiana Fever front office needs to understand what that means, not just for Sophie's free agency, but for the organizational loyalty calculation Clark is running in real time. And now, in the wake of the flagrant 2 foul and the podium defense, Sophie Cunningham has confirmed the decision that the coaching staff's behavior made inevitable. She is leaving at the end of this season because the environment that has created inside the Indiana Fever, the institutional alignment that defends opponents over teammates, that praises the player who attacked her over the player who bled, is not an environment Sophie Cunningham is willing to continue operating in.
Something tells me that Sophie Cunningham, she's not going to come out and practice and say, I ride for... She's not going to do that. You're a snake in the grass, Stephanie White.
She is not going to say, "I ride for you." That is the line, the specific, direct characterization of where Sophie Cunningham's relationship with stands after the podium defense of the coaching staff sold the Indiana Fever locker room on a message of organizational unity, of coaching that would have players' backs, of an institutional environment that respected and protected the people inside it. Sophie Cunningham watched her head coach prove that message false in the most public, most documented, most indefensible possible way. And she made the call. She is done. This is her last season, and the WNBA is in chaos because of what that means for the franchise she is leaving behind. To understand the full weight of Sophie Cunningham's confirmed departure from Indiana, why it is not just a free agency story, but a seismic organizational event that reshapes everything around Clark, you have to understand what Sophie has actually been to this team and this player. She has been the only active player in this league who has consistently, publicly, and at documented personal cost, been willing to say what everyone watching closely already knew: that the institutional environment around Caitlin Clark has been deliberately hostile, that certain coaching decisions, certain organizational communication choices, certain league-level responses have been designed to manage Clark down rather than build her up. Sophie said that in her own name while she was still active, while the institutional consequences for saying it were real and visible, and when the targeting that has been directed at Clark all season was finally directed at her when two hands came down on her head and the blood appeared in her mouth. Her head coach stood at the podium and praised the competitive spirit of the player who did it. Sophie Cunningham is done with this organization, and the basketball world needs to understand what that means.
One of these days, it'd be nice to see you stick up for Sophie Cunningham. The one player in this league, the only player in this league that's ever stood up for you. It would be nice.
The only player in this league that has ever stood up for you. That is the specific, documented reality that Sophie's departure places in sharp relief. Because the question the basketball world is now asking, and that the Indiana Fever front office has to answer, is what Clark's situation looks like inside that organization without the one person who has been willing to say publicly what Clark is experiencing. Without Sophie, Clark is navigating the coaching relationship with Stephanie White alone. Without Sophie, the locker room dynamics that have been building all season, the tensions, the institutional alignment failures, the documented pattern of coaching decisions that work against Clark rather than for her, lose the one player who has been a visible, vocal, documented source of support and validation. The organizational loyalty calculation Clark is running changes when Sophie leaves, and the direction it changes is not toward recommitment.
If that was Sophie Cunningham in place of Caitlin Clark, and Caitlin Clark got clotheslined in the face, do you think Sophie Cunningham would need to get a question addressed to her to speak out and defend Cece and set the record straight? No, Sophie Cunningham, she'd make it her business.
She'd make it her business. That is the standard that Sophie Cunningham has demonstrated all season, while Clark has maintained the measured public composure that their different personalities and different positional situations have made appropriate for each of them. Sophie speaks. Clark competes. Together they have been the most important alliance on the Indiana Fever roster, the voice and the player, the public defender, and the franchise talent she is defending. When Sophie leaves, Clark loses the voice. And what fills the silence in that locker room, what takes the place of Sophie's unconditional public advocacy, is the same coaching staff that just stood at the podium and defended the player who left Sophie bleeding.
I will never utter a word in Stephanie White's defense again. Never. She's sick, must be fired. What a joke. For a coach so openly disregard her own players' safety is absolute insanity. Stephanie White is an embarrassment.
Absolute insanity. An embarrassment. Must be fired. These are not fan sentiments from the outer edges of basketball discourse. These are the reactions of established sports media figures who have been watching this coaching staff's relationship with player protection all season and who recognize the podium defense of Carrington as a breaking point that no organizational spin can manage. Sophie Cunningham recognized it too, and her confirmation that this is her last season in Indiana is the most direct, most credible, most institutionally significant response that any player could give to a coaching decision of this magnitude. She is not staying in an environment where her head coach defends the player who left her bleeding. Here is where the full picture comes into focus, and the picture it forms is one that the Indiana Fever front office has to look at honestly and urgently. Sophie Cunningham is leaving at the end of this season. The confirmation is reportedly firm. The reason is documented a head coach who defended the player who attacked her over the player she attacked. A coaching environment that has spent an entire season failing both Cunningham and Clark in ways that are visible, documented, and now producing the roster and alliance consequences that the front office should have prevented. What does Indiana lose when Sophie walks?
No solid coach would ever take the side of the opposing team's player who committed a flagrant foul on one of your own players. Terrible coaching. The Fever need to defend their players.
The Fever need to defend their players. That is the standard, simple, non-complicated, the baseline expectation of any professional coaching staff in any sport at any level. When your player is attacked, you defend her, not the player who attacked her. Stephanie White failed that standard, visibly, publicly, on live television, while Sophie Cunningham's mouth was bleeding, and the consequences of that failure are now producing the exact outcome that the front office should have recognized was coming when they watched the coaching staff's relationship with player protection play out all season. Sophie Cunningham is leaving, and the coaching staff that made her leave is still employed.
Indiana Fever need to let Stephanie White go. No solid coach would ever take the side of the opposing team's player who committed a flagrant foul on one of your own players. Terrible coaching. The Fever need to defend their players. Here we go. Caitlin's body language says it all.
Caitlin's body language says it all, because Clark was in that room. Clark watched the press conference coverage. Clark processed every word of the podium defense of Dejanay Carrington, and Clark's body language, described by multiple observers as someone working very hard to contain what she is feeling, is the visible expression of the same assessment Sophie has now confirmed verbally. This coaching staff does not have their backs. Not when it matters. Not when the blood is visible. Not when the flagrant 2 foul is on the replay and the ejection is documented, and the entire basketball world is watching what the head coach is going to say. Not then. Not ever. Sophie confirmed it with a departure. Clark is confirming it with body language that the cameras are catching and the basketball world is reading correctly.
Folks, when I first saw this, I said this must be AI. When I first saw Stephanie White stick up for Dejanay Carrington, I said this must be AI. Look at Sophie Cunningham, bleeding out the mouth.
This must be AI. That is the reaction, the disbelief that a professional head coach would look at a replay of her own player bleeding from a two-handed flagrant foul and find the words to defend the player who did it. That a coaching staff could watch that play and arrive at the institutional decision to protect the opponent over the teammate. But it was not AI. It was real. Stephanie White said those words. Sophie Cunningham heard them. The basketball world heard them. And Sophie made the decision that those words demanded she make. She is done with this organization. Now let us be precise about what the Indiana Fever loses when Sophie Cunningham walks out of that locker room for the last time. They lose the most credible, most vocal, most publicly documented defender of their franchise player in the WNBA. The player who has been telling the truth about the institutional environment around Clark all season, who has been doing it at personal and financial cost, who barely survived financially while spending her platform on truths the league would have preferred she keep private. They lose the alliance that has defined the most important relationship in their locker room. Clark and Sophie, the franchise player and her unconditional public defender, have been the emotional and competitive core of whatever this Indiana Fever roster has been able to produce this season, despite the coaching failures and the roster inadequacies. When Sophie leaves, that alliance is gone, and what fills its absence is the coaching staff that just spent a press conference praising the player who left Sophie bleeding.
Say it out loud, CC. Yeah, that's where I'm at. That's where I'm at. I know that might sound a little harsh, but that's where I'm at. Say it out loud. Defend the one player in this league that's actually gone out of the way to defend you. Sophie Cunningham, by the way, tweeted white privilege, right? Sophie Cunningham, by the way, tweeted white privilege after this play. League policy, you're banned from electronics or posting online until all post-game media obligations are fulfilled. So is Dejanay Carrington going to get reprimanded or suspended or face any consequences?
Say it out loud. That call for Clark to publicly defend Sophie the way Sophie has publicly defended Clark all season is the call that the basketball world is making. And it reflects a genuine, urgent human dimension of this situation that goes beyond the coaching decisions and the organizational dynamics. Sophie Cunningham went to war for Clark, season long, at personal cost. In a league where speaking uncomfortable truths about the institutional environment around a teammate has institutional consequences that fell disproportionately on Sophie's shoulders. Clark saw all of it. Clark knows what Sophie has done. Clark's body language in the aftermath of the press conference tells the story of someone who wants to say something and is calculating whether this is the moment. The basketball world is asking her to make this the moment, to speak for the player who has always spoken for her. Here is where everything lands. Dejanay Carrington came down with 2 hands on Sophie Cunningham's head. Sophie got up with blood in her mouth. The referees called a flagrant 2 and ejected Carrington immediately. The basketball world watched unanimously across demographics from every perspective and arrived at the same conclusion. That was wrong, that was targeted, that needed to be addressed, and walked to the podium and praised Carrington's competitive spirit and defended her intent and said nothing about the player who was sitting in the locker room with blood in her mouth. Sophie Cunningham heard every word, processed every word, and made the only decision that those words could produce in a player of her character and her principles. This is her last season in Indiana.
I'm not sure that what Coach White endgame is in saying this. I'm confident she might lose some players' respect in saying this. This is wild.
You have to fight for your players. That is the standard, the non-negotiable, baseline professional coaching requirement that has now failed in documented ways across an entire season, and that she failed most visibly, most publicly, most indefensibly in the aftermath of a flagrant 2 foul that left one of her own players bleeding. Sophie Cunningham is leaving. The WNBA is in chaos, and the coaching staff that made her leave, that chose to defend over Sophie Cunningham at a professional press conference on live television, is still employed by the Indiana Fever. The front office has to answer for that before Clark makes the same decision Sophie just made. Sophie Cunningham had blood in her mouth. Her coach defended the player who put it there, and Sophie confirmed for the first time publicly on the record that she is done with this organization. The WNBA will never be the same.